I'm a game warden in Northern California. As an outdoorsman, it's a dream job. But that's not to say it's without its drawbacks. For example, whether we're having summer heat or freezing winter temperatures, I'm expected to head into the woods to protect our land's natural resources. And of course, dealing with armed and sometimes drunk hunters is a risk. Despite all this, I love it, and couldn't see myself ever doing anything else. That is, until a few months ago. Deer season in all its various forms runs a few months out of the year. Generally October through January, and up to April in some cases, with the busiest season being in November. But around here, some folks forget about deer season altogether and strike out into the woods during the summer. That's where I come in. It was this past August, and we had already sighted dozens of poachers in the county. Fortunately, none turned violent or had gotten out of hand. I was on good terms with a lot of the people who lived out in hunting territory. Most of them had big properties with some type of water feature which drew the deer in. It was late afternoon when I got a call from one such person who told me he had seen a group of 3 men with rifles cutting across the back of his property line. I called it in and headed over to the property. If it was the group I thought it was, they wouldn't give me too much trouble, and so I knew I would be fine to approach them on my own. That was a mistake. After a brief conversation with the property owner, I left my vehicle parked in his driveway and headed out into the wood behind his home. On the way, I saw plenty of deer droppings, and the trees were marked up from shedding bucks. I'd have to remember this spot for myself. I walked in following a game trail for about 30 minutes but found no sign of the illicit hunters. This was odd. There really wasn't any reason for them to have gone any deeper than this. What's odder is that besides the signs, I hadn't seen a single deer. Right when I had decided to turn around and search in another direction, I came across the carcass of a dead buck. Its neck was broken. Pale eyes stared at a 180-degree angle from its chest. Its body was crushed into the ground. Running my hand along its rib cage, I could feel that they were shattered into pieces. Its hindquarters had been torn off and lay 10 yards away, bloody entrails strewn across the ground like tree roots. I'm not prone to panic, but this was bizarre. The poacher certainly hadn't done this, and I knew of no animal that could or would enact such violence. I snapped a couple of quick pictures with my phone and started moving quickly back down the trail. That's when I felt it. The ground began to tremble slightly, and I heard a series of heavy impacts behind me. Despite being stricken with fear, I turned to see what it was. From the forest came a massive creature, at least 10 feet high and half that across. Vines, leaves, branches, and twigs were wrapped around the creature in its entirety, like it was a walking piece of the forest floor. It walked on a pair of thick tree stump-like legs, and its arms ended in a pair of dense foliage roughly the size of a human head. I couldn't see anything that resembled a face. I stood frozen. The creature was taking slow, ponderous steps, not going in any specific direction. Hoping to get away quietly, I started backing slowly away, eyes locked on to the creature. Bad idea. I pulled a stupid move and accidentally stepped onto a dead branch. The noise snapped out like a gunshot. The lumbering beast snapped in my direction and after a brief pause began storming towards me. I ran. I ran as hard as I ever had. In spite of its size, I could hear the creature keeping pace with me, crashing through the brush like a tank. I finally got a lead when the trail narrowed, the creature being so massive that it needed to force its way through. I cut around a curve in the trail and it was momentarily out of sight. I heard a thunderous crack, and looking behind me and up, I saw a tree falling into the forest. Then I felt something grab me. A man with a rifle slung over his shoulder pulled on my arm and told me to follow him. I could hear the creature back out on the trail, once again crashing through the forest. I followed the man for a minute until he led me to an overturned tree that had created a deep depression in the ground. 2 other men were already tucked in underneath. My savior and I joined them, the 4 of us packed tightly together. We sat for an hour, none of us saying a single word. We could hear the monster stomping through the forest, searching. Once it came close enough that we could see it, two of the men readied their rifles for a last stand, but it ambled away without incident. When at last it grew quiet, the four of us left the safety of the tree and ran. We ran all the way to the tree line without seeing the creature, and there we stopped to catch our breaths. It was obvious that these were the poachers I was with, but they had literally saved my life. As a group, we agreed to never speak of this incident for fear of ridicule. Wild allegations like this could cost me my job. And with that, the three of them headed off towards their truck, which they said was close by. I returned to the driveway, and fortunately, the owner wasn't home. I was too shaken up to have a normal conversation anyway. I called in and said I didn't find the poachers and that I would be cutting my shift a few hours early. I'm still a warden, and I still go into the forest every day, but it's not the same. I don't feel a sense of calm or peace anymore. I'm constantly on edge, dreading that I will encounter this thing again. If you have any suggestions for how I can move on, please let me know. I'm a park ranger stationed in the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont. I became a ranger 5 years ago to live out my dream of spending my days in the rugged beauty of the mountains. However, I recently requested to be placed on strict desk duty. The thought of going back out there, well, I'll probably never go out again. Let me explain. The Green Mountains aren't exactly a tourist hotspot. Most vacationers tend to drive through on their way to Lake Champlain, and that was just fine with me. I felt a sense of kinship with the folks who did visit, and always enjoyed my time speaking with them on the trail. And that's why, even as I finished a shift one late afternoon, and a call went out for a missing hiker, I turned right around and headed back into the mountains to find the lost man. He was in his late 40s and had become separated from his two teenage sons along one of the more demanding trails. He had hung back to rest while they went ahead to explore, and when they returned, he had just vanished without a trace. Night was falling and a rescue copter wouldn't make it out until the morning. Unless he was seriously hurt, he would probably be just fine. But I saw an opportunity to help, so I took it. God knows that I wished I hadn't. I kept a full pack in my truck, and after confirming the search grid, I headed off on my own. Since I was technically off duty, I wasn't a part of the official roster, so I volunteered to check out a few locations where I thought he would most likely be. And about 2 hours later, night had completely fallen, and I had had no luck. I figured I would start making my way back to the service station and call it a night. But on the way back, I thought I heard someone calling out from deep in the forest. I headed in the direction of the voice, but as I approached it, it abruptly cut off. I was puzzled and a little worried that something had happened, but the voice cried out again hundreds of yards away. Now from the completely opposite direction. I once again trekked towards the voice with the same conclusion, but the voice cut off again. This was very disturbing. There was no way someone would have been able to change positions that quickly, especially in the dark. I called out several times but received no response. I decided to keep moving and continued down the trail, but just a few minutes later, I heard the same calling sounds. I decided to keep still this time and see what happened. The voice cried out several times, but I remained stationary and silent. Several seconds lapsed, and the cry came again, this time closer, and now with a more desperate edge to it. Something felt wrong. I don't know what, but some gut instinct told me to continue going down the trail, so I did. The voice didn't like this. I had gone maybe 30 yards down the trail when the cry came again, this time coming from the place I had been a few moments before. But this time, the voice was angry. Not shouting for help, but rather demanding I stop. I didn't, and instead I began running. A shriek of rage pierced the night air, and I felt a violent tremor rip throughout the forest floor. I was sprinting down the trail, and the voice continued its constant shrill wail. Then another one came from my right, followed by a third from my left. All throughout the forest, a chorus of voices screamed in that same wrathful tone, screaming for me to stop, then to come back. At this point, I had no idea where I was, and each direction I headed seemed wrong. In this moment, I felt a fear like none I ever had before. And now the screams were losing their humanity, transforming into something sinister, like a manifestation of hate and fury. Then another scream from just ahead on the trail. I skidded to a halt and snapped my flashlight forward. There stood an immense black form, roughly the shape of a man but 10 feet tall. It was shimmering like it was fighting to be both there and not there at the same time. I stood still for a moment, and then the thing started racing towards me. I cut from the trail into the forest, running like I was in a sprint. Low branches whipped at my face, and within minutes I felt the sting from half a dozen small cuts and scrapes. Even here off the trail, the screams continued. They even increased. Every few minutes I saw another shadow out of the corner of my eye, or caught one in the haze of my flashlight beam. I zigzagged through the forest. Twice I felt the presence of a creature as I rushed past. I could feel a grasping hand fall just short of grasping my arm or leg, and then the trees would erupt with another screech of fury. And so went the entirety of a long night filled with unspeakable horrors. For hours I ran through the woods. The screams filled the forest throughout the long night. A moment didn't pass without hearing it. Other things happened, and I can't bring myself to put them on paper. Not yet. I made it out. Somehow I made it. I wouldn't be writing this if I didn't. As the light grew slowly in the sky, the screams faded, the swiping of clawed fists disappeared, and the shadows diminished in size until it all finally ceased. By a miracle, I had ended up in a location familiar to me, and it was only a 2-hour walk to find help. When I eventually made it out of the forest and found aid, I was taken to a hospital in Burlington and treated for numerous minor injuries. I even received several visits from my superior. When questioned, I simply told him I had gotten lost in the forest and had panicked. I'm a seasoned outdoorsman, and my story received disbelieving looks and some questioning, but in the end it was dropped, and I was left to recover in peace. If I told the truth, I would probably be placed on leave, which, as I think of it, might not be a bad thing. It's been 2 weeks now, and the missing hiker is still nowhere to be found. I hope he is still alive, but deep down I know that whatever is out there found him. As for me, I'm still here just shuffling papers across my desk with no plans at all to head back out there. I had planned to spend a week camping and exploring Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota in the summer of 2015. Voyageurs is pretty remote, and to be honest, I was a little nervous traveling solo up there. There are only 2 campsites in the entire park that don't require a boat to access. I had done quite a bit of solo travel in the past and told myself that everything would be all right. I had just seen the movie Backcountry, which was a gruesome film about a predatory black bear that attacked 2 campers in Canada. I blamed that for my uneasiness and brought 2 extra cans of bear spray. It was a 5-hour drive to the park, and my fears seemed to settle by the time I reached the park in the early afternoon. I had reservations for 2 campsites during my trip. The first was only a 20-minute paddle from the lot where I had parked my truck. The second campsite, which I had planned to reach on Thursday, was a great deal more remote. As soon as I reached the forest on the other side of the river, my fears returned. It was the silence. I didn't realize it at the time, but that's what it was. And it wasn't just the kind of silence you get when the animals see a human in the forest. It was like the whole landscape was frozen. Nothing moved at all. Not the wind, not the leaves on the trees, nor the clouds in the sky. There were no birds, no squirrels, no bugs, nothing. Like I said, I didn't realize what it was at the time. I just knew something was very, very wrong. I kept my bear spray close as I set up camp. The strange silence would come and go throughout the evening, and I did my best to ignore it. But what came later I could not ignore. It was a stench. An ungodly, rotten stench. I was putting out my fire for the night, and suddenly it smelled like the whole forest had died. The smell was everywhere. I looked around for the source, but I couldn't pinpoint it. I circled around the campsite, and the smell was just as strong on one side as it was on the other. I didn't know what it was. The only thing I knew is that I did not want to be in the woods that night. But then the smell disappeared after maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And I mean completely disappeared, like nothing had happened at all. I went to bed about an hour later and I didn't think about the strange smell anymore that night. Over the next few days, I would encounter the strange smell on and off. It wouldn't last longer than 30 minutes, but it was all-encompassing when it happened. It was so bad I could barely breathe without gagging. After the third time it happened, I realized that it was preceded by that strange, unnatural silence. The forest would get quiet, like it was frozen, and then the smell would arrive. And when the smell disappeared, the forest would come alive again. I was averaging about 15 miles a day on foot, and more than that if I traveled the waterways in the pack raft. And somehow, the smell would follow me wherever I went. I thought there must be something medically wrong with me. The forest would go silent, and it felt like I had suddenly lost my hearing, and then this stench would fill the air with no source. It had to be me. I must be having some sort of hallucinations. At least that's what I thought at the time. I realized later that I was being followed. I stuck with my plan of reaching the remote backcountry campsite by Thursday afternoon. The trek to get there was mostly by water, and it was in the water when I finally saw what had been following me and causing that horrible smell. I was in my pack raft when I saw a pack of wolves swimming across the river. It was a rare sight even in northern Minnesota. There are definitely wolves in the backcountry, but they are rarely seen. There were 4 wolves, and they were swimming with determination. What I didn't notice at first was the elk swimming behind them. I couldn't see its face while it was in the water, just the antlers. At first glance, I thought it was just a pair of antlers or a skull floating in the water, since elk shouldn't even have a full set of antlers this time of year. But as I watched it closer, it was definitely swimming, and it looked like it was chasing the wolf pack. The elk's whole head was submerged underwater. I had no idea how it could hold its breath that long. As I continued to watch the scene unfold, that strange silence fell upon the water. I didn't need to wait for the stench to arrive before I knew that whatever was below those antlers was the thing that was following me in the forest. The wolves reached the shore and bolted into the woods beyond it. The creature was still swimming. I started paddling upriver from the direction I came. I knew what was going to come out of that water was some sort of monster, and I wasn't about to spend another night out here with it. I had created some distance between the creature and myself, but not enough to feel remotely safe. The creature emerged from the water, and the stench hit me despite being at least 50 yards away. It was a revolting sight. It had the body of an elk, but it was basically a walking skeleton. Its fur was white and nearly transparent, as was its skin. In some places I could see the pink of its organs through its skin, but that wasn't even the worst part. It had no hair on its face. I don't even think it had skin. It looked like just a skull with 2 dark sockets where its eyes should have been, and a gaping hole for a nose. It turned to look at me as if it was deciding if it should pursue the wolves or me. I had my bear spray, but I had doubts it would work on that thing. It watched me for a moment as I very slowly paddled backwards before taking off down the path behind the wolves. I can't tell you how fast I paddled out of there. I haven't been camping alone since, nor have I ever smelled anything like that ever again, but I know that if I do, I'm getting the heck out of the woods before I meet anything like that again. Seeing it once was more than enough for me. This incident happened nearly 5 years ago, but it still shakes me to my core. My family and I frequented a lake house that we owned a few towns away. We planned our stay hoping it'd be a sunny weekend, but it ended up that a storm rolled in on the day this happened. I left for the lake house first, figuring I'd set up ahead of everyone. Plus, I wanted dibs on the back bedroom. It had beautiful dark cherrywood French doors that opened up onto the back patio. I cleaned up and settled in, and by this time, late afternoon was fast approaching. The dark clouds were starting to roll in, and along with it, a cool breeze. With no hesitation, I went out to the back storage house to grab some fresh-cut wood we had stored out there. I flipped on the light switch and proceeded to grab a few logs to put in the wheelbarrow. Just before I set the pieces of wood in, the light bulb started swaying with the wind and flashed over the bottom of the wheelbarrow. Upon further examination, it looked like a dark reddish-black gunk. I didn't give it much thought at that point and continued loading wood on. As I rolled the barrel over to the front door, I made it just in time as rain began to pour. Once I had the fireplace going, I didn't mind. The taps of rain on the window and warmth crackling from the fire nearly put me to sleep. I would have fallen asleep too if my phone hadn't rung. It was the rest of my family calling to tell me that they were stuck behind a tree that had fallen during the storm. I didn't mind being alone, actually. I enjoyed my own company. With the storm, the trees and branches swaying outside started to sound more and more extreme. I could hear branches tapping against the window, but still I was unbothered and thought of it as soothing chaos. In an attempt to occupy my time, I flipped the television on and turned to the news channel. I could see the county was already being plagued by rolling blackouts and figured our area might be next. Wanting to be prepared, I searched around each room for spare candles. Not after long, I had a little collection of candles ready just in case. Then a light bulb went off in my head, and I remembered that the portable backup generator we had was in my room. I made my way down the hall and felt a strong wind coming and could see movement from the light coming out from under the door. I busted into the room and saw the French doors wide open. I rushed over and closed them and locked them, thinking the strong wind must have opened them. As soon as I closed those doors, I heard a knock at the front door. It couldn't be my family, I thought. They were still stuck in traffic. And no one ever comes out here other than us. I reached for a baseball bat in the closet before slowly making my way towards the door. I stepped up to the door and glanced through the peephole and saw an officer. Well, this was better than what I was thinking, and so set the bat down and opened the door. "Hello, ma'am. I was passing through and wanted to warn you that the roads leading into town are closed," he said. I told him I was aware of the situation and was perfectly fine. He nodded and looked past me like he was looking to see if anyone else was inside. I felt bad and reluctantly asked if he'd like to step inside. After all, he was drenched from the rain and seemed out of breath. He came in and removed his hat and set it in the kitchen. I noticed he had a standard police hat, but the rest of his outfit seemed like a casual outfit. I wasn't a fool and wanted to be safe, so I asked to see his badge. He let out a chuckle and said, "Well, of course you can't be too careful." He reached into his back pocket and flashed his badge. I could tell he felt the need to explain further and went on to tell me it was his day off, but given the situation was called in. My mind was more at ease and I offered him some coffee. I told him he could warm up by the fire if he'd like, but oddly enough, he sat a safe distance from it and claimed he was warm enough in the house. We talked for around an hour, and I made my way to the kitchen to put our mugs in the sink. The window in front of the sink overlooked the road, and I didn't see a cop car in sight. Things started to go off in my mind, but maybe I was overthinking it. When I returned to the living area where I left him, he was gone. I cautiously walked around calling out for him. He wasn't in the bathroom, so this is when I started to worry. As I made my way around, I heard commotion coming from the back storage house. I peeked through a window and saw the door to it was wide open. Immediately, I grabbed my bat again. I don't know what came over me, but I had zero fear as I rushed out to the back storage house. Rain was pouring down and trees were swaying. Still, I trucked myself out there. The closer I got to the back storage house, a foul smell plagued the air. Just as I was about to step inside, I went to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. I was frozen from what my eyes were witnessing. There he was, with his back towards me, hunched over, squelching and chewing. Red liquid dripped to his feet. I backed up against the side of the door, and he paused and slowly turned. His mouth was covered in blood, and a grimace of a smile took over his face. I remembered his teeth, sharp and long. "I was hungry, and you were good company," he said. My eyes pulled away from his mouth for a second, and that's when I noticed the lifeless rabbit in his grasp. All I could do was fall against the door. That's the last thing I remembered. The next thing I knew, I awoke abruptly to find myself on the floor of the back storage house. I shot up, and there next to me lay the remains of the rabbit. Next, I noticed that a blanket had been laid over me. Could it be that I was just spared by a vampire? And was it because I was good company? People already think I'm a bit of an odd duck. But seriously, I think it's because I have an open mind, and it freaks them out to realize not everything is within their control. Being unconventional is really what led me to this encounter in the first place. Because normal folks aren't out roaming neighborhoods at 4 in the morning, I just wanted to earn some extra money to send my kids to a good school and move out of my mother-in-law's house. I tried the usual job boards and help-wanted sections to find something part-time, but everything was going to interfere with my kids' schedules. So I finally paid attention to this flyer that kept showing up in our mail for newspaper deliverers. This was back in the day when that was a thing. The problem was I had to wake up at 3 in the morning, and I am not an early riser by nature. I had to get down to the distribution center to roll up the papers and stuff them into bags. What a waste of plastic, really. But living in West Virginia, the weather is unpredictable, and you can't imagine how angry people get over a damp newspaper. I had close to 300 papers to deliver. I'd pile them in the back seat of my car and get out to my route around 4 in the morning. It was mostly peaceful, really. Everyone was asleep except me. I'd look at the dark windows and wonder about all the people who lived there. There were a lot of cottontail bunnies out, though. That's when I became super aware of nocturnal creatures. Those bunnies were taking care of their business like it was the middle of the day. And the foxes, and the raccoons. All the people sleeping and oblivious to the worlds that opened up in the dark. And at this particular time of year, moths. It was May, and I don't know if you're aware, but there are close to 2,000 species of moths in West Virginia. Moth eggs hatch between April and May, and I mean some years they come out in swarming hordes. That year was especially bad. They were everywhere. Parts of my route were easy. The residential neighborhoods with the houses in a row. Most of those people were fine with me just tossing their paper as close to the porch as I could get it. But there were always the ones, you know? They wanted their paper tucked in a specific slot beside a specific bush under a particular beam of wood. Oh my gosh, I don't know how they live. For those, I had to get out of my car and tuck the precious newspaper in its exact spot. Everybody had their porch lights on. Guess what moths are attracted to? So whenever I had to approach a porch, those buggers would swarm me. You can't imagine how they would flap and flutter all around me and get caught in my clothes. I had really long hair then, and they would swarm into my hair like they were going to build a cocoon in there. They really eked me out. My goal was always to get back in the car without bringing a bunch of them with me. It was impossible. That was bad enough, but then you should have seen the apartment buildings I had to do. I had to go down this stairwell toward the incredibly bright lights they had lighting the entrance. There were hundreds of moths trapped in the stairwell. They'd get down there and be unable to figure out how to get out. Picture me holding a huge bag of newspapers, fumbling with my master key to get in, and being pummeled by hundreds of moths swirling all around me. It truly looked like I was starring in a horror movie. I'll tell you, my paycheck did not reflect that. So I'd get in there and try to slam the door behind me, but inevitably dozens of moths would follow me in. It was endless. Like I said, that was an especially bad year for them. Anyway, that was all well and good. I'd get in there and leave the papers and get out as fast as I could. But this night, I came up the stairwell, and laying there was a mangled raccoon. It looked mangled, but flattened, and like it had somehow been sucked dry. I screamed so loud. But then I'm running toward my car, and I kid you not, something is crouching on the roof. I had parked in a dark spot to avoid the moths, you know, so it was hard to see. But this thing was crouched and looked like it had huge black folded-up wings, and it was scratching at the roof of my car. It looked toward me, and its eyes were gleaming red. If you thought I screamed before, you should have heard me scream then. It was an ungodly scream, and I took off back to the apartment building. I was shaking like a leaf, but I managed to unlock the door and get back in there. I ran up the stairs to a landing and looked out the window where I could see my car. It was still there, scratching and scratching. But then this thing stood up on my car. It was like the size of a man, and then it leapt into the air and just swooped away. I couldn't even move. It was petrifying. We didn't even have cell phones in those days. I waited there until sunrise, and then when someone came out of their apartment to get their paper, I told them I was the delivery person and asked to use their phone. I said I had car trouble, which wasn't exactly a lie. I went outside and all the moths in the stairwell were gone. There was no evidence of moths anywhere, but the roof of my car was a maze of scratches.